Welcome to the Curve Thought Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Rhlamfu. I've been on hiatus for about a month now from doing this. A lot's been happening in my life that has robbed me of the time, energy, and mental clarity to do this properly. But having realigned all these things, today I'll be speaking with Ndimphiwe Mayekiso, otherwise known to many of you by his online alias Saint D. D is very carefully nuanced with how he presents what he thinks. He usually has a good reason to think what he thinks. But most importantly, D is open to changing his mind and open to hearing you out. As a result, we had a fantastic conversation covering a large variety of topics such as religion, racism, race within games, representation, culture, tradition, and a lot of things in between. D is wonderful to talk to for the main reason that he is able to separate himself from your thoughts and allow you to expand on your view and give you a clear response to them without deciding in advance what he thinks about what you're going to say. The conversation we had was, in some sense, kind of frustrating because we agreed on so much, but he helps to illustrate where my own ideas were limited and where I could have thought more deeply on a given subject. And overall, I came away feeling better than when I went into this, feeling like I learned something and feeling like I'm better able to understand the topics that we discussed. And without any further ado, I give you Saint D. So, recording. Alright, so Saint D, welcome, Mr. Ndimphiwe Mayekiso, better known to a lot of the people in the world as Saint D. How are you doing, man? How are you? Thanks for joining me. What's up, man? How are you feeling?
Thanks for having me, dude. I'm I'm great. I'm great. It's been a long while since I've done anything podcast related. I think I think the last episode we did of the EAE gaming podcast was like 2 years ago, and that's me cutting it thin. But yeah, I'm good. I'm pretty good. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good as well, and I'm actually glad that you brought that up because the last time that we spoke primarily about gaming, and I think a lot of the people that know you or know your name will probably be familiar with you through the lens of gaming. So with that in mind, I think it's a pretty good place to start, right? Talking about gaming and things because in some sense this is the future. I was made very aware of this last weekend. I'm not sure if you know, but there was a big Mortal Kombat tournament. Not Mortal Kombat, sorry, Injustice 2. The land finals were at this random murder house type place in Pretoria. And while we were there, I was kind of bothered by the fact that not everybody was like super hype on it, but it was still very clear that this is now becoming a legitimate thing within the world, within our country especially. In the future, people will be able to make money off of games, which is always great. But obviously, there's still some problems, right? And one of the things that you brought up now was there's an upcoming FIFA tournament on the 22nd and the 23rd, and
Yep.
Lala and Somizi are going to be hosting that. Um, Gamers might have different problems with both of them, but you in particular were talking about an issue people might have with Lala. So could you expand on that? What happened that might leave people with a salty impression about Lala hosting this thing?
Oh man, so where do I start? So the thing with Lala Hirayama, for those who don't know her or aren't aware of her, she's been like very involved in Vuzu and Vuzu related shows, which happen to revolve around celebrity culture, what's hype with the youth, that type of stuff. She used to do interest pieces for I can't remember the show for the life of me, but there used to be a Vuzu show that primarily revolved around gaming and gaming culture. It was pretty much how gamers in SA used to kind of connect with the rest of the world as far as what's coming out, what's hot, what's everyone interested in, and that kind of thing. So, uh, for for a little bit of context, some might remember that Pippa Chabalala used to host that show. I'm not entirely sure where she ended up. But on this very show, this may have been in 2011 or 2012 when she did an interest piece
The
on.
Verge. Sorry to interrupt you, but that's
There
what it's
we go,
called.
The Verge.
Yes.
The Verge. That's the name of the show. So she did an interest piece on rage. Now, the intent of this particular piece was to have a light tone, have a lot of comedic elements. So to quote her, she went into the land of Mordor at Rage, and that was essentially the Nag land. For those of you who are aware with Rage, you guys will know that whenever Rage takes place every year, there's a Nagland. Folks go there, they bring up their rigs, their PC, their laptops, their gaming gear, and they game
Microphone
for the
muted.
entirety of the weekend.
Microphone activated.
Now, with the intent of doing an interest piece with a light tone, with a comedic tone, a lot of that wasn't very well received. Primarily gamers who engage online didn't like the tone, and to them it seemed very much that the intent was not to poke fun, but to rather insult. So things like asking random gamers questions like, "Have they showered this weekend?" And I'm not joking. That is one of the things that was asked, among other things. And none of the content really veered into actual gaming. What are the guys playing? What are they interested in during the experience? What's the general vibe of the Nagland? Instead, it took the comedic approach, like the way she phrased the entire adventure as the land of Mordor and going into darkness or whatever. That should give you an essential idea of the tone that arises from her entire adventure. So once again, she's involved in gaming through VS Gaming. Apparently, she'll be hosting along with Sumiz and Flongo at the VS Gaming Festival. So it brings up an interesting question of, will the community be ready to accept her back into their graces? Because she was involved in The Verge, and until that incident, peeps were okay with her.
What I find interesting about what happened there, though, was this is one of the strange things about gamers, right? And you find this everywhere, really, within the gaming community, is that if you interact with gamers online, right, you will find some of the most toxic individuals, some of the most entitled individuals. It'll be guys that will talk honestly the most amount of shit humanly possible to talk within any given time frame, right? These are people who will demand that you have an exceptionally thick skin. They'll be like, dude, come on, don't be so sensitive, don't be so triggered, bro. Come on, it's just a joke, bro. Just take it like a joke, bro. But whenever they themselves are viewed in the same light without the attendant protection of anonymity, right, or without being able to hide behind the keyboard, suddenly they become some of the most sensitive people that you'll ever actually find. These are guys like you said, they'll come out in force being like, no, you're insulting us, you're not really showing us in the correct light, you're taking us out of context, etc. Because I remember that segment, like, I don't know, some of it I wasn't really paying attention, but like one of the questions she asked, like, have you guys showered, right? Objectively, a question you can ask at Rage. I've been to the Rage land, right? Honestly, if you're at the Nag land, that's a really deep question to ask, because I did not meet nobody I knew. The only people I knew who showered there are people who left, right? If you stayed there, you weren't showering. You're gonna be playing, and like, you'll hydrate, but you're not really gonna shower, right? But I think the problem people might have with her, I don't know, actually people might have that much of a problem with her. I think the gamers also tend to have a very goldfish type of memory. People might have just forgotten by now that it was a big thing. For me, the bigger thing was when I saw Sumizi, I'm in two minds about this, right? And the reason why I brought up the Injustice event that we did I was at this last weekend, is because when we were there, the one of the commentators was a guy who actually plays Injustice, plays the game, very involved in it, understands the moves, etc. And then one of the guys who was just there also commentating. He's a streamer as well, but he's not really involved in the game. He was more there to hype it up, give some sort of connection to the rest of the audience. And I think that the reality of our situation right now in South Africa is that gaming is not taken seriously at all, right? It's not. It's still viewed very much as a hobby, a hobby that yes could be lucrative for some, but it's still very much a novelty hobby, right? Something that you just do when you're not really being serious about life. You're not taking it as a big deal. It's just lols, basically, at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, gamers themselves are quite bad at PR. Like it's very difficult for gamers to convince non-gamers that gaming is a legitimate enterprise. It's still at this point something that if you're already a gamer you get it, but if you're not a gamer you just don't get it. And it's very hard to find. Like I haven't met anybody in the last 5 years who I haven't met anybody recently who says that 5 years ago they were not a gamer at all. Like they weren't playing anything, but now they are a gamer. It's one of those things
Yeah.
that it seems to be a wholesale hobby, and having somebody from outside of that community does help give it that sense of legitimacy if you know that this person is usually involved in legitimate enterprises. So Mizi, for example, is a guy that people know that he does real things. He does legitimate things. He does, when Sumizi is involved, then there's a greater guarantee that the thing that you're pursuing is actually matters, right? Because Sumizi doesn't necessarily attach himself to vacuous things. However, on the other hand, it's still like that's the reality of the situation, right? But looking at it optically, it's still not nice to see that people who aren't necessarily passionate about gaming are the people that are put forth as representatives of it. And that's still something that I don't know. It's a problem. I can see why. Like, and I can understand why Telkom wants to do this because if you had not somebody else, if you had a non-gamer, like an actual gamer there wouldn't
Yeah.
necessarily be that connectivity to not people outside of the industry and people, and that's who you really want to draw, right? You ideally want to get new gamers, and the gamers. It honestly, the people who are going to be there for FIFA, right? The people who are going to be there for the game would be there even if there wasn't a host, even if there wasn't a commentator. They just be there for the game, right? So actually, I don't think that this kind of thing is for us. The presenters aren't necessarily for us. I mean, it's nice and it's a cherry on top, but as gamers, we'd be there for the game anyway. And I don't think that's necessarily going to change regardless of what they do. Um, yeah, so that's how I think I feel about the two of them. Lala has some level of legitimacy with people already. It might be bad, but people know her. Whereas Sumizi is just known throughout, right? But actually, that's interesting. Something that I just thought about. Now we can talk about why do you think that it is the case that gamers tend to be some of the most toxic individuals within their games and yet expect to be treated like saints effectively when you interact with them in real life.
The I don't want to be a cynic, but the reality of the of the situation as far as gamers and their duality as far as when they're behind the keyboard or when they're in real life. The reality is you put anonymity as a mask to people and gives them the freedom to, for lack of a better phrasing, be complete asshats. Like that's literally what it comes down to. You put anonymity to a person and they can do whatever they want, they can say whatever they want without any real consequence. And I think that's the thing. Any lack of real consequence allows them to be the most toxic people online. But coming back to this music thing, I think for the most part I agree that this is an actual logical choice that Talcum has made as far as getting Sumizi and Lala involved, because ultimately, when you boil it down, if you say Sumizi to anyone in the country, that is a recognizable name. That is a brand. I'll even go as far as saying that is a brand. I mean, the first thing most people will probably think about will be the thing that he's most involved in now with is SA Idols. And then you think of Lala, even outside of the fact that she has maybe some notoriety on the verge as far as gamers are concerned. She is a name. She is a brand, and on top of that, maybe she has notoriety amongst the gamers, but she actually does have some gaming cred. Because The Verge was a legitimate gaming show. Um, no matter if you put the context of the the rage incident. So I get it, and on top of that, you also have to think about what kind of game is going to be essentially the flagship of this event. It's going to be FIFA. Going to be FIFA. It's not like it's going to be Dota. It's not like it's going to be Counter Strike. It's going to be a game that even people who aren't necessarily involved in the gaming culture, this is a game that most people know in the gaming sphere, outside of the gaming sphere. So it's not like we're talking Dota 2 or CS:GO or Hearthstone or any game that has a high barrier of entry. This is FIFA. This is football. So I totally get where it comes from. And then as far as another point you mentioned, as far as it not being a great feeling, as far as people who are not passionate involved in it, I guess on the FIFA side of things, that is probably their choices are warranted because as far as the landscape of gaming right now in South Africa, FIFA, even though it's a game that speaks to the lowest common denominator as far as how many people enjoy it, whether they're hardcore gamers, I despise the word, but it works in this context. Hardcore gamers, casual gamers, or or anything in between. It's a game. It's a game that doesn't garner much numbers as far as event wise. So I totally get the move.
Speaking of actually the lowest common denominator or just sheer numbers of people who actually play the game, something that we can actually this actually might be a nice segue into what I want to talk to you about as well. When it comes to how we look at professional gaming in the country, right? The people who are actually making it a real professional, legitimate enterprise. It seems to me that of the games that garner the most amount of prestige and a general level, that being CS and Dota mainly within our communities. These are games that are overrepresented by a minority of people. Like meaning that it's mostly, if you look at the top teams, the teams that actually are reputable, the teams that are able to travel the world as a result of it, the teams that are winning the lion's share of these prize pools, it's mostly white people, right? Mostly, it's the usual 16 to 30 or to 30 white male demographic. But FIFA seems on its face in terms of the player base to be more representative of the rest of the country, right?
Yeah, I think that's a sound assessment.
But that, in some way, this is actually a problem because the fact that the demographics of the games that are actually legitimate, not just here but abroad as well, that they of the team games especially, that they're usually represented by these minority of by white people, right? Is this is something that actually I was speaking to someone about this, about how it feels like this is still a hangover from our past, right? This is still a situation whereby, because generally for a lot of these games, right? So FIFA as a game, to get really good at FIFA, right, doesn't necessarily require a lot, right? You need a TV, a console, and FIFA, and you're done. And you have all you need, and you can get really, really, really good at the game, right? Whereas
Yeah.
with Dota, with Counter Strike, etc., the game you need a very good internet connection. You need top rigs. You need great hardware. You need to have a community of people around you that are also very good at the game. All of these things translate into high amounts of cash that you basically need to buy into before you can even consider going pro at any one of these games, right?
Yep.
Now, this high amount of disposable cash that you need is something that's not necessarily available to black people, right, within our country. And it's an expense that's in general hard to justify, right? Because I think like we can agree that to become pro at most games, right, you kind of have to start playing games when you're a teenager, right? It doesn't if you're past 21, like you can maybe, but at that point it's kind of late, right? You ideally want to have, as a young person, be able to get into those games And as a result, you need to be able to convince your parents that it's a useful expenditure to get you these things in order to play these games. And it's easier to convince your parents that, listen, this one time at Christmas, spend 5 grand, buy me a console and FIFA, or spend 7 grand, buy me a console, FIFA, 2 controls, and then you'll never hear from me again ever. I can take my console to my friend's house. We can play. We can get good, etc. Whereas the same is not necessarily true for having a high-end rig. This is a long-term investment, an investment that needs to be continually updated. Um, and that's something that's a lot harder. I know from my own experience personally, it's a lot harder to convince your parents to do that at a younger age than it is to do with something like FIFA. But sadly, what this translates to is the situation where we're at now, right? So, for example, thinking of the last couple of tournaments that have happened for any of the popular games, right? For Dota, Counter Strike, will include Hearthstone. We could even toss in League of Legends, maybe even some Rocket League, etc. The people that show up to these events, right? Even like so, the people that show up to the console events in particular, right? Whenever there's a console event that's specifically just on console, right? You have
Yep.
a greater spread of black people pitching up, right? Black people will be there because it's just a console. You can get this, you can play. However, at the PC exclusive events, if you observed, not even just the players one thing, but the crowd as well, the individuals that are actually interested in this, it seems to be overly represented by white people, right? And now and you also see this, sadly, in the YouTube comments. This goes back to the point you were making earlier about when you have anonymity in a keyboard, right? If you
Yep.
have YouTube comments for any given event that's non-console, right? I guarantee you're gonna find some really fucked up racism in those comment section, and it's gonna be bad, dog. It's gonna be terrible.
I know.
Um,
I know.
Having been a on the other side of the camera when this
I
shit was
know.
happening, it's can confirm it's not nice to get off camera and then you see the YouTube stream and you're like, guys, come on. You're like, I thought the word coon was over. Like, oh, okay, cool. Like, I thought you could, it's bad to be insulted by a dude who can't even spell the word gaffle correctly, but that shit happens, and you're like,
Yeah.
oh, okay. So what do you think about that? What do you think we do to actually try and remedy this particular problem? This problem that is directly a result of barrier of entry, because that it seems to me that until that changes, right? Until you have a situation where the barrier of entry to get into especially PC gaming isn't so high versus console gaming, right? It's as much as we as South Africans, we always are hoping for the gaming scene to take off, to get really big, to be able to compete on an international standard, right? And that is definitely happening, but it's in some sense being slowed or bottlenecked by the fact that in order to get more players, because you need more players for a better scene, right? In order to get more players to make the scene healthy, we need to do something to lower the barrier of entry, and that only seems right now feasible within console gaming, whereas it doesn't necessarily seem feasible in PC gaming.
Yeah, that's a difficult one to tackle because the question then becomes, where do you start? Let's for a hypothetical case, let's say you're gonna have teams start sponsoring this equipment, which essentially alleviates the barrier to entry. Where do you start? Does it mean you're starting now with a much younger generation? Because ultimately, if we're going to draw parallels to actual actual sports outside of our own realm, football, rugby, and the like, these people start grooming at a very young age. Like you've got an academy system, and maybe that's where we start. Because if you remove, ultimately, our biggest problem is the barrier of entry. Um, so maybe you start there, and eventually try to equalize the population of professional gamers through, I guess, raising them in a more diverse sphere. Maybe that's where you start. But it's difficult to suggest anything for the gamers that are already existing within the ages that go beyond 20, because at that point, because you made another point where you said, if you haven't been gaming at a young age, it gaming is pretty much it's pretty much an alien concept to you. At least the idea of professional gaming. So how do you even convince the majority of people who are all about FIFA, who are all about um, I'd even go maybe to your fighting games, your Mortal Kombat, your Street Fighters. How do you convince these guys to switch over to the more popular games and equalize that population? It's a difficult one to tackle because once again, investing in those for for MGOs to think about investing in those players who have been gaming on console, haven't been gaming on PCs, but are now at an age where it's a it's a weird zero sum game to try and invest in them. I don't know, man. it's it seems very difficult to tackle the problem with our current generation.
Yeah, I
I mean,
agree.
think about just even the hosting personalities or even the casters. You can count probably on one hand um this as far as how many casters or hosts within the professional gaming realm that are either black, Indian, or colored.
Actually, let's do that. That sounds like an interesting thought exercise. So within Counter Strike, the only prominent black person that I know in Counter Strike is Tools. To
Tools
Yeah.
from Does he still play for?
No, he started his own team. He left. He left WRG. He plays for Big Five now. He started his own
Okay.
squad. Yeah. So, but he's the only prominent black person I know. Ironically, there was a FIFA event. About, was it last year? Yeah, it was
Hmm.
last year that we had, and he was actually casting with me. We were the ones that were doing the FIFA. Me, him, and a couple of other guys. Were doing that. So he's the only black person I know prominently within the CS:GO community. Um, Actually, I don't. Is there any other person of color in CS:GO that you're aware of that's prominent?
Nope.
Okay, so
That's literally the only one I know.
in CS:GO we've got one. In Dota, there's me. There's Reigns, Jackie. Jackie's great. He's an Asian dude.
Hmm?
Should we add you to the list? I'll add you because I don't want to have only a few people. We'll add you to this. One day you'll make your comeback.
I mean, I've been on hiatus for a while, but I guess you can add me.
But you're known. You're known. Definitely, people know you, right? It's not like you've fallen prey like just under the bus, right? So people definitely
Yeah.
do know you. Um, there's Seam, there's Habibi, there's Wazoo, there's Smacker. Um, who else? I guess we'll count Flares as well.
Yep.
But wait, but those
Flares,
are
I
players.
guess.
Wait, okay, let's
Those are players.
yeah, let's actually not count players. Let's just count people just behind the mics, right? So then we'll count the players separately. So then there's Tools, there's me, there's you, there's Jackie. Um, who else in Dota is prominent?
Do you wanna spread this and I guess add women as far as the diversity pool?
If we add women, then we're gonna add Succubus. So we'll add
We're
Chanel.
gonna add, yeah, we're gonna add Succubus.
Uh,
Yeah, and does Tech Girl count?
no, no, no. Like we can. I don't wanna. There's people who do like more behind the scenes things, like
Yeah.
interviewers, streamers,
Okay,
etc.
so we're
We're
just
just
talking
people.
commentary.
Mm,
Okay. Yeah, it's a small pool.
so that's like 5 people, right? Including if you include players in this, right? Even in CS, Tool's the only prominent black player that I know.
Hmm.
Um, there are 0 prominent black players in Dota. Are there? No, there's not a single black player in Dota. There's a couple of Indian players. There's, like I was saying, there's Habibi, there's Seam, there is Smacker, there's Wazoo, there's Doppler.
Yeah.
Um, who else? Flares. Okay, Flares is Asian, so we'll count Flares. That's 6 players. Um, who else? I'm sure there's more that we're just like forgetting about right now. TKC is Indian.
Yeah.
That's 7. Um, God, this should not be this difficult in a country that's 70% black, but yeah, that's it basically.
Hey
Of
man, it's that barrier to entry.
It is
It's
that
that
barrier to
barrier to
entry.
entry.
Whereas, like, if you go to console gaming, right? If we jump ship to that direction, there are Like for example, every Mortal Kombat, Injustice, and FIFA event that I've been to, right, is mostly non-white players. It's mostly people of color that are there.
Yeah.
In almost all respects, especially at the upper echelons, when you start getting players
Mhm.
that are really good, like your top 10 players are mostly non-white people. So that kind of, for me, illustrates what's happening here. And like you say, it's a barrier to entry, but it feels like this is a problem, and it's not a problem necessarily simply for the optics, right? Because I guarantee there's gonna be a lot of people saying, "What does it matter? What the fuck? You guys are just talking shit. Let people play the games they're good at and whatever." But this is a problem for the health of the ecosystem, especially for PC gaming, because there comes a point in any given game. Unfortunately, for any, I don't know any Battlefield or COD players. Um, like I don't know those games very well, so I can't necessarily weigh in on that. But the fact that the ecosystem is being maintained by such a small, because gamers are a small percentage of any given population anyway, like serious professional gamers, right?
Yeah.
And if your ecosystem is being maintained by a minority of a minority, then you go eventually, right? Eventually, you're gonna run into a situation where the veterans move on, and whoever's left is basically can't maintain the system.
Yeah, they
Um,
don't have the tools or the skills
mm.
to keep the ecosystem alive.
And that's like one of the problems that at the Counter Strike weekend, right? When I was there, one of the things that I noted, the team that came third, DC,
Yeah.
great team, and they've been playing for a long time. Like this is a team that's been together for like 10 years now, and they're obviously amazing and they're fantastic, and they've done pretty much everything you could possibly do within the game, right? But they came third, right? And I feel like that shouldn't be happening. That there shouldn't be a situation where the most experienced team came third, and they come third consistently, right? It's the only teams that plays better than them are the teams that are legitimately the best, which is usually EN and Bravado. But the fact
Yep.
that the ecosystem is small enough, right, that nobody else is able to attain the skills just in general across the board, right, to be able to be better
To
than
get to
these
that
guys,
level.
to get to this level, right, than the guys that have been doing this forever, effectively, right? To me, it feels like a problem. That it feels like there's not enough young blood in the scene, and usually what happens in our ecosystem of PC gaming is that the young blood gets subsumed, like energy and bravado comes and just snaps up the young blood anyway, and keeps it top heavy. So it stays top heavy basically forever. Um, and that creates another barrier to entry, because if you're not at the level where you'll be brought up by energy and bravado, it doesn't necessarily seem like a worthwhile enterprise to pursue. And because of that, a lot of people don't bother. And because it's such a small minority of people that are playing these things professionally, the loss of any one of these big players is felt like resoundingly throughout the scene. It like diminishes the overall capacity of anybody else to compete professionally when one of the big players leaves, or stops playing, or just like pursues other interests. This is a problem. I don't think necessarily that's going to be, from what I've seen from the console gaming side of things, from FIFA, especially now with FIFA, like a lot of money is going into that. But from FIFA, Injustice, Mortal Kombat, it doesn't seem like the problem is, even in Street Fighter to a lesser extent, doesn't seem like the problem is that present. Like, there seems to be always a player to fill the void, but that doesn't seem true of PC gaming. And I also don't, like, speaking of this as a problem, I also think that it doesn't necessarily help that PC gamers, as a general rule, aren't kind to newcomers, right? But generally, from what I've seen, take a dim view of the race question to begin with. So it's very difficult to actually convince people in the PC gaming ecosystem that, hey guys, you have to go out of your way. Not only do you have to profess to support this, but you have to go out of your way to get black players here because it's good for you. Like everybody benefits from this kind of arrangement. But these are not words that are happily spoken within the PC gaming side of things. Whereas you'll speak to guys who play console and people will say, well, duh, is going to be the response on that side of things. And that's I actually don't know how to communicate that. Actually, what do you think it would be the best way to say this, to get this idea across to the PC pros, as it were?
So the one thing I will bring up, and this will probably bring down a little bit of ire towards me.
Mm-hmm.
But the one thing that I can somewhat laud MSSA for
Mm-hmm.
is that they're very inclusive in what they try to do. Because if you look across the board, as far as as far as their esports leg goes, whether it's FIFA, whether it's even Dota 2, League of Legends, it is because I've paid attention to some of their player listings and people involved in it, and it seems like there's a bit of an even spread somewhat around that. I don't know if this is purely because this is more of a governmental thing. I'm not entirely sure, but that's one thing I will say as far as may be taking a slight positive from from an organization that people view with complete ire within our space. Like you bring up MSSA and folks just bring out their pitchforks. And then on the flip side, to go back to the point you were making as far as the barrier of entry, just in general, as far as any social questions, as far as PC gamers. I mean, ask any woman and they'll tell you just how difficult of a space it is to get involved in, whether it's professionally, as far as playing, whether it's being behind the mic. I mean, sure, you have a lot more prominent figures. You have a few prominent figures right now as far as when it comes to the behind the scenes stuff. Seeing your succubuses show up, you've seen your tech girls show up. But even that's a very small percentage of a very of a rapidly growing group. And I guess that even speaks to a more global issue, because it's all good and well that we're talking about a very lopsided population as far as the local community, but even internationally speaking, we're still seeing that kind of a lopsided divide.
No, we do definitely. Like if you follow the international scene for fighting games as well, you'll also see that it's overly represented by people of color, whereas PC gaming is still like overly represented by white guys. Well, in the non-Asian countries, in any rate. But the point that you bring up about women is also very interesting, because you will see that I don't. How long ago was this? Maybe it was last year or the year before. I don't know. But there was something somewhere about where people were looking specifically for female Dota players. I'm not sure if they wanted to make a team or for them to be casters, but there was something about it, right? They were like, specifically, we only want women involved in this thing, right?
Yep.
And collectively, our local scene lost their fucking minds, and they were like, "What? No, guys, what is this PC bullshit? This affirmative action type of nonsense. What are you doing, etc., etc." And back then, I think me and you spoke about this, about how you're like, the reason why women don't want to do this thing is because of exactly the response you guys are having right now. You're making it difficult for somebody to even want to. If you know that from the onset that your involvement is going to garner some pushback simply by being yourself, before you've even done anything, simply by appearing, people are going to be mad at you. It makes it very difficult to even want to do it. Using succubus as an example, often, or I actually don't remember the last time that I saw succubus, for example, make a mistake and get called on the merits of the mistake in and of itself, right? In terms of the streams, usually this is usually what will happen, right? She'll say something, someone will disagree, and then the sexism comes out. People will talk about, no, she doesn't know enough about the game, or because she's a woman, she's spending too much time on her makeup, what, all that kind of bullshit, right? And I get, okay, so people like being anonymous, fine, whatever, right? But doesn't it seem odd to you and very problematic, right, that whenever that anonymity is applied, the lever by which it's applied, right, usually involves sexism and or racism, almost unilaterally, unless it's a white dude on camera, then nobody gives up. Then they find something else to talk shit about they find the content of what he's talking about to be salacious. But if there's a content error, this is usually what comes up on the flip side of it. That sexism and racism will come up, and it's very disheartening on the one hand, but at the same time, it's it poisons the discourse in such a way as, because like there's some people, right, who you know that if you spoke to them in an individual capacity might not necessarily conform to the ideas that are being said in the comment section. They might not even say this shit. And all credit, there's a lot more people, right, who are defending or like who are calling this bullshit out when they see it, right? But there's also people who, even though they might not necessarily conform to these ideas in their individual capacity, will
They
say these
engage in
things.
it.
They engage in
They
it, right?
engage in it. Yeah.
Because this is what we do. Like there's this level of conformity that like, and sometimes you'll see situations where if somebody will call out this behavior and say you guys are talking shit, then the reflexive response from everybody else is, stop being such a sensitive bitch. It's like, what are you doing? This is just the internet, people just say whatever the fuck they want. And the fact that usually the calling out of this bullshit, right, is very rarely from people who conform in their entirety to it's very rarely young white men that are calling out this bullshit, right? It's usually, if you look at the comment section, it'll be a woman that's watching, it'll be a black person that's watching, it'll be an Indian person watching, it'll be a gay guy watching, but it's really gonna be your usual regular straight white male who's gonna say, hey guys, this is kind of bullshit, stop your shit. Usually those are the cats that, even though they wouldn't necessarily feel this way themselves, they'll do it. And there's this groupthink that sort of applies to the entire tenor of the conversation, and that's very
bit
difficult.
of a hive mind.
It is, yeah. It's very much of a hive mind. And like, have you seen what happened? Do you remember last year when that thing happened on the SA Daughter group? When somebody was like, let's start a post calling out all racism and shit that we see in games.
Oh, I remember that. See, so here's another thing. I don't know. Like, for some reason, there is a lack of empathy, or I mean, it's just a sheer abundance of apathy, rather, as opposed to a lack of empathy. But what normally happens when a post goes up in the two group, calling out racism, calling out any form of any form of discrimination, whether it's derogatory comments based on race or sex,
Microphone muted.
usually what happens
Microphone
is
activated.
that
Microphone muted.
the resounding majority of folks commenting on this post will, for the most part, be either acknowledging the problem and saying, but there's nothing you can do, or for the most part, it boils down to lowest common denominator saying, it's the internet. What the fuck do you expect? I mean, I remember when I was still actively casting, just going back to piggyback on the thing you mentioned where someone was looking for female casters. I don't know if you remember that I was also actively looking for female casters, whether it's folks that needed to be trained or whether
Yeah.
it's folks that needed to be trained in hosting, but some form of diverse casters to add onto the roster that we had back in that time frame. And one of the things that shocked me was the lack of response from women. Like, a lot of the posts got no response from women, and then eventually what happened is I started I hounded Shiva and at Proof Dota. She did Canadian Dota back in the day. Would cast a lot of tournaments for the Canada stuff.
Yeah.
And the response that I got from them pretty much boiled down to how big of a barrier of entry there is to anything related to esports, specifically in the PC gaming realm. I mean, even I spoke to Mayhem. She's no longer doing really personality stuff, but back in the day, she used to play for Queens of Paint, which was a multinational team, had a few Russian players. They took part in the tournament that Shiva organized for women only. And speaking of that tournament, the existence of that tournament pretty much offended everyone.
That
But yeah, I don't know. It's it's a difficult space and it's a toxic space, and no one's willing to actively make it better.
I think part of the
I think your mic's off.
problem, right? Oh, my mic is off.
Microphone activated.
Part of the problem that you'll actually end up finding in a lot of these situations is that the the community response, like you say, it's extremely toxic, right? And no one is. The reason I think part of the people don't want to make it better is that there's this fear, right, that if you piss off too large a segment of this particular community, that they'll leave and go elsewhere, right? That if you rock the boat too much, or if you say something that doesn't necessarily conform to what everyone else is thinking, then shit just goes off the rails. It's no longer relevant. People will just castigate you, and basically you've created a situation where your game or you yourself are no longer relevant because you're no longer given that legitimacy, right? But I don't know. It seems to create a situation where you're basically forced to pander. If you don't pander to the audience or pander to what the audience wants to hear, then they basically fuck with your product, and that's a genuine problem. Something else that also comes up very often, and which I'm also not sure entirely how I feel about it, right, is that the way just gamers as a whole, right, especially in game, how we communicate with each other. Now, I do I get the requirement for salt, right? Sometimes there's a lot of space for salt and some BM and to, not be nice, right? But it just seems to me that there's this almost overall refusal to take into account that the other person is a person and that the other person doesn't necessarily deserve to be treated with your maximum assholery at any given time. Actually, I think it's mainly an entitlement thing. Like, people feel like they are entitled to be as bad as they can because whatever, I'm playing the game, this is my time, this is my thing that I'm doing. And it's hard when you're not necessarily in physical contact and you don't see the other person, right? It's difficult sometimes to contextualize the other person as being a full agent in and of themselves. You view them sometimes as part of the game, and as a result, you are free to treat them as you would any other aspect of the game, which means as freely as you wish, given that they're just part of the space that you're enjoying, and you can do whatever the hell you want.
Essentially, they're not a human.
Yeah.
Because you can't visualize them.
Yeah.
There is no visual representation to tell you, hey, this is a person who has feelings.
Yeah. Also, gamers, and this is definitely going to piss off a lot of these gamers tend to be, in person even, right, honestly, extremely immature individuals. And I don't mean immature in the sense that they behave like children, right, but gamers are immature when it comes to communicating with other people, right? There's this... Gamers are bad at disagreeing, for example, are bad at having a civil disagreement, talking it out, seeing where we get to, right? Usually when a gamer disagrees, or worse yet, if you dare criticize a gamer, right, the response you get is basically, you would imagine that this dude just found you like in his house with an axe smashing up all his shit. People go fucking insane. And you end up in a situation where, like, even the slightest of criticisms, you'll say, hey, this is a thing I notice that you're being bad at, right? It's very, like, it genuinely surprises me whenever I find players who are open to that level of criticism. Like, and usually, interestingly, the players that are good at this kind of communication are the players at the upper echelons, right? The top of the top, are good at that kind of communication. Whereas the trenches, when you get deep into the trench, like, you find some of the most immature people that you could ever come across. Immature, self-entitled. And I guarantee that the fastest place to usually find these immature, self-entitled people, do not be surprised if you find these people in the comments of this video. And they, like, where it becomes... Now I just called them, but if this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, it'll be like, oh, Vele, this is not unexpected.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? I think maybe that just speaks to a general human condition, as far as engaging in fruitful discussions. People people always have to be right. It's never about sharing ideas, learning from each other. It's always about being right. So what you always have in situations where you point out someone potentially maybe at fault or pointing out something they could be doing better, they're not, to them it doesn't come across as, hey, you could totally do better at A, B, and C. To them it comes across as, you are terrible at A, B, and C, and you're trash. And and I guess this maybe comes from, maybe there's a little bit of context to that, in the sense that maybe they are used to being engaged in that manner, where it becomes a bit of a circle jerk, in the sense that the initial engagement that they're used to is, hey, you are trash, you suck ass, and the like. And then at this point they don't learn how to engage in a fruitful situation.
Even that, like, I'm not entirely sure that being told you're trash and terrible at something is necessarily a bad thing, because I think it becomes a bad thing when the implication becomes that you will remain there and that you'll remain trash and awful at this thing. I definitely think there's space to be told you're trash at something. Someone says, dude, this thing you're doing is bad. You're bad at it. Stop doing it or do it differently. I think it comes down to what you take away from the things people say to you, because I think there's a huge gulf between someone telling you you're trash and you hearing that you'll always be trash. Because for me, it feels like if you're told you're bad at something, right, that should be impetus for you to improve upon it, and then disprove the other person, rather than like, I don't think it's useful to hear someone says you're trash. I don't think the useful response is, no, you're trash, which is what usually ends up happening, right? It doesn't feel like a useful way to go about it. Like, it would be, for me, much more interesting if somebody said, what do you think I should do to to get out of this trench, to stop being trash? But like you say, usually that form of discourse isn't necessarily entertained, because people like being right.
Yeah, people like being right, and again, it becomes a question of, because if you tell someone they're trash, the easy thing is to engage in vitriol. That's the thing. It's the easy thing to say, hey, what could I be doing better? That requires you to think about the situation and contextualize what this person is saying, and take a little bit of responsibility and say, hey, I could be doing this better, or learn from this person. And then I guess for me, that brings up the question then, is the initial engagement, does the person initially engaging also have a bit of responsibility to not be toxic?
I think so, but I also think at this current moment in history, it's a bit much to expect from gamers for them to not be toxic, because it seems like gamers really enjoy actually being assholes. Like, yeah. So here's the thing, right, that I find extremely worrying about the way that the community communicates, right, is that there is very often, it's a source of pride to see how many people you can offend or piss off in any given space of time, right? And people, there are names I can name, right, which I won't, but there are names, bras, who revel in their ability to piss off as many people as humanly possible in a short space of time,
Yep.
right? And these are people within our communities. Now, the issue with this, right, is that very, very often they are not seen as the assholes that you would expect them to be seen as, right? But they're seen as the rogue, the maverick, that cool guy who is brave and daring enough to do the one thing we all want to do, but no one else has the balls or the guts to do themselves. And as a result, they don't experience the social isolation and neglect that you would hope they'd experience as a result of their behavior. They get treated far too well because of it. And that toxicity tends to, it becomes self-reinforcing, right? And especially, I think the problem comes in especially when the player is good, right? Because people will say, well, he's an asshole and a jackass, but he's good at the game, what can you do, right? As if there should be there should be just one definite line that says, well, this guy's an awful human being but a good player, what can happen? As if you can't apply pressure around on that person to keep his skill. Fine, keep your skills, bro, but be a better human being. And And the problem with that is that this spills over it spills out of the game as well. Like it's very difficult to be toxic in one place and one place only and then
Yeah.
leave it there, right? Human beings are very bad at parsing how they communicate, right? That's why, for example, you'll find out you can go to work, right, and find somebody there who the person in the workplace who is saying outrageous and salacious things in the workplace, right, isn't the guy that goes home and then doesn't say those things, right? Because this is the way you communicate with other human beings is the way you communicate with other human beings, right? You don't. It's very hard to separate it from yourself unless you have to teach yourself very rigidly, like this is acceptable, this is not acceptable. But if you don't do that, then it just it becomes who you are. It becomes a part of the fabric of yourself, and you can't separate it even in different contexts. So you start being toxic in game, that toxicity spreads out of the game, and you become a worse human being because of it. And who can tell you otherwise? Because part of the problem is that no one's
No one
telling
can
you
tell
shit.
you otherwise.
No one can tell you otherwise. No one's telling you to stop this behavior in game, so you don't feel necessarily the need to stop it out of game. And and even the people that will criticize you in real life, it's easier to dismiss them because the space in which you normally allow yourself to operate in that fashion in the game, right? The place where you go to relax, to unwind, to actually be your true self, that becomes a place when you're not being challenged by any of this, right? That becomes your safe space, as it were, and
Yeah.
it becomes who you are. Now, speaking of disagreements, right, on of like being able to communicate properly with people, right? Um, for the last like hour or so, we've basically agreed on everything, right? There's a lot we agree upon, right? Within the gaming industry, there's a lot of problems within it, and we agree for the most part on what we perceive as being the issues, right?
Yep.
Now, out of gaming, right? Speaking of different things, right? You heard the conversation between myself and Guidance a couple of weeks ago, and my thought patterns on belief and religion. Now, me and you, we both have similar backstories in that we grew up with some level of Christian upbringing, but
You say some level.
a lot of
You
it.
say some level.
Yeah, a lot of it, right? Which is also a thing that a lot of other people experience in the country, but where we are now, right? We differ now in where we are because as much as I don't like the word, it's still in some sense useful. I would be like a complete atheist at this point, whereas you'd still be agnostic on this, right? And
Yeah.
we've had a lot of conversations. We had a lot of conversations about this when we were both believers, but we haven't really gotten into the meat of this after then, right? So let's talk about this. So yeah, why are you where you are actually? What was your thought process in getting to where you are, and no further than that?
Oh man, where do I start? And it's gonna be interesting because now I'm not entirely sure I'm gonna be openly sharing this podcast episode.
Ooh, actually, all right. Let's pause there because I actually think that's a much more interesting conversation we can have right now, right? Because personally, within my own experience, when I stopped believing, right, when I left the faith and I left the tradition,
Yeah.
it took a while, maybe 6 7 months, but quite some time, right, wherein I was still operating fully within the parameters of my life as I was as a believer, right? So I was still going to church, I was still going to cell groups, I was still going to conferences, I was still leading prayers with the family, that kind of thing, right? So my life from the outside, right, you would never imagine, and even in my communication with some of the closest people to me, from the outside, you would actually never imagine that my views on the belief system had ever changed, right?
Yeah.
And the major reason for this, right, the primary reason for this, and I think it's probably the primary reason why you feel some discomfort discussing where you are right now, was how I knew my family would view me and how I
Yeah.
knew the people in my life, what their response to me, right, the things that they would say. And even up until this point, right, I care less, like virtually I don't care about it anymore, but I can't deny that there is still some emotional baggage I carry with me around that. And it's very hard to within our families talk about how you feel differently to everybody else, right? And I think this relates to the issue we were discussing earlier about the groupthink, right? But this problem seems most prevalent in black families.
Oh, very much so. Very much so. I think, oh man, I think one of the key things is, aside from the historical context of where some of these religions we have found ourselves in, aside from the historical context of how they came into our lives, we took them up, and when we took them up, one of the biggest things that happened is that it became I don't even know. This actually seems like a very somewhat pseudo masochistic situation as far as the historical context of black families and organized religion. But this seemed like it was the one thing that held them through, and it became, aside from the fact that it was a faith situation, it also became a familial tradition. So aside from the faith comes the familial tradition. So not only is a family believing in a specific deity and in whatever organized religion they're viewing that specific deity through, they're practicing this belief as a family, right? That's one of the key things that I guess is a hallmark within a lot of black families. And when a religion or a faith is a familial tradition, then what happens is, not only when you leave it, not only are you betraying your faith or being the lost one or any other way you might be described or seen through the lens of your family, but on top of that, you are abandoning something that is part of the connection that you have with your family. And that's actually probably, at least in my eyes, that's probably part of I guess the biggest, it's part of the biggest portion of why it is very uncomfortable for a lot of folks who may have differing opinions, differing views, whether it comes to faith, whether it comes to religions that they're following within their family, to voice those.
No, I hear you. And I think part of the problem as well, beyond simply the inability to voice it like that, is not only is the religion part of the thread that connects you to the rest of your family,
Yep.
it becomes a situation where you start. I know I started. This is something that it happened to me. After moving out of believing the same thing as the rest of my family, you start noticing that basically any view or opinion that any given family member might hold is often interpreted through the lens of the belief that existed before, right? So
Yeah.
you'll find yourself in a situation where you actually can't, I'm not even saying it's hard, you can't have a conversation with some of your family members because everything they say and everything
It's
they,
through the lens of
it's through the lens of the
this
belief,
faith.
right? And now, if you disagree with the point that they're making as a result of that belief, right, you are in fact disagreeing with the belief, and that's normally I'm fine with that because I am, but it now makes it difficult to have any kind of conversation because it's one thing to say you're undermining someone's opinion, right, or undermining what they think about any given issue. It's another thing entirely to say that you are undermining the underpinnings of their belief, and
Yep.
that
Which is
conversation,
supposed to be an absolute.
yes, it is an absolute. Like there's just things you can't say, right? There's
Yeah.
views you can't hold, opinions that are given zero credence, and it creates a situation where you end up receding from your family, right? You end up receding from the people that ostensibly exist to give you the closest amount of comfort, right? Because you honestly don't feel like you can talk to them, right? Like I know for me, it's the process of literally coming out, coming out to my family as a non-believer, right? It was stages, right? And it took a long time, even after, because even after I became comfortable saying it to a few people, right? To the larger family, it was still very hard to do, right? And And I think the main problem for me as well is that it's not viewed as legitimate. It's not viewed as a
Legitimate
stance that
opinion
one
to
can hold.
have.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's often interpreted. It's just like you're going through a phase. You are just this is just a thing for right now, let me tell you, for example, one of the things that my uncle actually said to me, right, when I told him, after I finished my engineering degree, and I told him, hey man, listen, I want to go see you. I was like, hey man, why are you gonna go to get a job? I was like, nah, I want to actually go back and study again, get back into academia. And then he said to me, no, just make sure you don't end up like those white people who study too much, and then you end up rejecting the Bible, right? And when he said this, right, to me, that sounded like an honestly insane thing for a human being to say, right? And I was like, dude, what the hell? But but I also
But you
knew
understand the lens that
I
he's looking at this through.
I knew that he was saying this insane thing to me with care and love. In his mind, this was the best possible advice he could have given me when I
Yeah.
like for this new venture in my life. And and what do you do? Like as like I understand from his position, but for me it was like, how do I separate the nonsense from the love he's very genuinely trying to display, right? But I can't. Well, you can't tell him, hey man, I reject your advice now, right? Because he's not going to interpret that as you saying, you're just having a disagreement, on you're having an ethical or like philosophical disagreements with the words coming out of my mouth. He's going to review it as a rejection of that care and love. So, so how do
That's
you
that's
untangle
that's
that?
that's what I'm saying. Like a lot of the foundation that exists within black families is faith, and that is a very heavily woven thread within a family, and you rejecting that is is most likely seen as you rejecting your family.
So, something else which actually comes up is non-belief usually within black families, right? Is there's actually a lot of things in black families that are interpreted as being from the white man. You know, people
Mm.
will tell you,
I know where this is going.
you know where this is going, right? But like, you'll often be told that like, hey, that's a white people thing. Stop thinking like white people, etc. Right? But
Hmm.
there seems to be this idea in not just in individual families, but in the larger black community. There seems to be this overarching idea that one cannot be black, be pro-black, and take on all the things that you would want from a black person, understanding their positioning in the world, as it were, right now. One cannot do all those things and not believe in God at the same time, right? So, for me, this is this is a problem for me right now, right? And it's a problem to the degree that every black atheist I know, every non-believing black I know, right, is almost generically very divorced from the black community. These are not people that spend a lot of time with other black people as a predominant group. These are
Yeah.
people that, and it's almost like clockwork, that when at some point when you stop believing, there's no longer a space for you in the black community. There's no longer a place for you to just be and operate without being held in a antagonistic light to those around you. It's almost um like sometimes it's tantamount to saying that you're like a Front Plus supporter or some shit. I don't know.
Yeah.
But like, so I don't know. How do you what do you think about this? How do you view
So
this problem?
it all boils down to something you said a little earlier. Almost everything, as far as faith within the black community, I'd even go as far as saying pretty much everything is viewed through the lens of whatever religion, whatever faith, whatever denomination, however many there are. Everything from from a random accident that happens to you to a random decision that you might make, or even premeditated decision that any person makes. Every single thing within a person's life is viewed through the lens of faith. So, and if you know anything about the Bible, which a lot of us, which a lot of us do, is that you moving away from faith to the eyes of someone who is within that faith and heavily steeped within that faith, it can be viewed as as any of a couple of things. It could be you have now been seduced by the fleshly world and associating you. I mean, I can't remember the phrase exactly, but to paraphrase the phrase from within the Bible, it pretty much says, do not associate with people who are not of your yoke. And that essentially is the rise of what you just mentioned. That essentially gives rise to people who move away from faith, essentially being either shunned from a community or their family situation, or them moving away of their own volition because ultimately they don't feel comfortable within that space because they cannot engage on any level that is devoid of faith because the rest of the community use everything through faith. And when that is the case, any disagreements based on something that isn't of faith it's difficult to engage because ultimately there is no other view aside from faith within the Black community. I don't know, it's difficult, and I guess that's what makes it even more difficult because being a person who goes through the change of, or even the position of questioning things in life, because one of the greatest things that you can do as a person is to question things. Questions give rise to understanding, they give rise to context, and they expand your horizons. But as a person growing up, finding questions within yourselves and finding answers that don't necessarily satisfy the question, but clamp down on those questions, that is a very uncomfortable thing. Like to the point where you yourself are essentially at war with yourself, at war with who you are within the family. It's a very difficult space.
So not to cut our white brethren or atheists any slack here, right? Because the thing that you're mentioning now about how it's very difficult to go against, basically it's like it's very difficult to go against the current, right? To be the person that's wants to behave differently, right?
Yeah.
A problem that you often end up finding in the atheist community, because the atheist community in South Africa that exists is almost entirely a white community, right? It's basically like Doda as it stands right now. One of the problems you end up finding is there's this expectation that once you become an atheist, or once you become a non-believer, once you leave any given faith, right? There's the expectation that you're supposed to
conform to certain things.
Yes,
as an atheist.
Like but like that conforming is you're supposed to view the entire project of faith as entirely an idiotic enterprise, right? Like there's a reason the trope exists.
You shouldn't be able to find merit in it.
No, at all. Like there's a reason the trope of the militant atheist exists, right? Because a large majority of people who become atheists, especially white men, tend to be very militant about it, right? And very dogmatic even in how they communicate themselves with the wider world, right? Now, in your view, right? So this is something that I felt way back then. I don't necessarily feel this way now, but I used to feel that the communication from some people from non-believers, right, and how vitriolic and how acrimonious the conversations were with them about their non-belief, right?
Very combative.
Very combative, and it tends to push you away from listening to them, right? And you actually can't talk to them because these are not people that generally tend to brook disagreement. It's either you agree with them or you're an idiot, and there's no nuance in how they view this problem or how they view that position, right? So in your own experience, right, I'm sure you've had encounters with some militant atheists before, right? how do you view this particular problem of the inability? All right, let me rephrase this. How do you view the fact that usually these white dudes that are talking shit about any person's given belief, right? Do you think that this is actually stifling the conversation in such a way as to reinforce even the worst aspects of the black community's belief because of how bad the communication is from people that don't believe?
So I guess this comes down to human condition thing, because if you look at the group you are referencing now, the militant atheists, they're basically engaging in the thing they fought not to become. Because ultimately, one of the reasons that people usually move away from faith is because of how absolute discussions end up becoming
Microphone muted.
in the space where you're talking to someone who is who is deeply faithful, who is deeply religious. Usually they're down to the letter, everything's black or white, this is right and wrong, this is good and evil. And when it comes to the militant atheist, it becomes a matter of this is
Microphone
right, this is
activated.
wrong, this is the correct way to view things, this is the stupid way to view things. So it becomes a matter of it's like two opposite ends on one coin, right? On one end you've got the extremely religious person who views everything within a black and white lens that says this is good, this is evil, this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is sin. And then you've got the militant atheist who will talk down. And I think this is part of the biggest problem, I guess, and it translates to different spheres, to different groups, even beyond religion, that people talk down. And that's actually that's probably one of the primary reasons I find it hard to put myself in any box or give myself real labels as far as where I stand currently. It's purely down to how a person gets uncomfortable being associated with the extremes of any of these groups.
No, extremism is, yeah. This is also a problem just in general because extremists tend to be very passionate. They get very energized, and
It's a minority. Keep
Yeah.
in mind that extremists are minorities, but these are the people who speak the loudest
to give an
because
example,
their words are unfiltered.
yeah, I think one of the best contemporary examples of how extremists can drive a conversation in such a way as to make their particular form of understanding or their form of belief appear to be the mainstream is with feminism, right? So
Yep,
you have a
that's
situation.
actually the first thing I thought about.
It really is like it's if you're on Twitter, right? If you're on Twitter or social media, or you just in spaces where people are speaking loudly about feminism, you will end up believing that all feminists hate men, that feminists see effectively every action that a man takes as being indicative of rape culture. You'll end up thinking that basically feminism is about hating you as a white man, right? Well, not you particularly, but just hating white men, talking trash about men in general, and seeing women as the pure beings and the future of humanity, as it were, right? However, when you leave those spaces and you get into contact and individual relation with like feminists as a whole, you'll find that that's not really the case. People don't
There's a
actually.
wide gulf between between um, between the real community you find that is comprised of feminists versus that interpretation of feminism.
Yeah, like basically, I think that the best way to crystallize, right, is that you can find a situation. It's the difference between Chimamanda, right, Ngozi Adichie,
Yep.
and Huffington Post comment section. It's
Yeah.
like
Ooh, Huffington
HuffPost
Post.
comment section. Jesus Christ! Wow, wow. Wow. Now, as much as I think that it is really bullshit, right? That every white man, or every man in general who's opposed to, who thinks he knows what feminism is, right? Seems to have this idea that the whole world is out to get him. There's gang persecution against them. Just this entire victimhood complex, right? I've actually never. You will not find a group of people on the planet right now who are as victimized in their mentality as white men. White men, yo, my God, you would think that a Holocaust just fucking finished. How these guys
So
talk about what's happening.
so I have a few thoughts about that. About potentially where it comes from. Yeah, I think I'll focus on potentially where it comes from. So ultimately, um, to a person who's lived who lives the ideal life in the shoes of a white man. Um, Now, when I say that, people need to understand that while I do think this is the majority of the experience, it does not necessarily mean that it is everyone's resounding experience. But when you can't relate to it, I think maybe it comes down to being able to relate to or even empathize with another person's experience when it is so extremely different. So right out the bat, um, in most cases, when a black person is relating an experience of their life to a white man, usually a lot of it seems preposterous. Like like a resounding majority of that narrative that is being explained by the black person, the woman, by the Indian person, just any experience that is different from the white man's experience seems completely alien, and they can't relate to it. And when their ideal life or life or even a life of perceived hardship from their side doesn't seem as hard in contrast to the lived experience of a black man, the lived experience of a woman, and the list goes on. When it doesn't seem like it has that much hardship, for one, explaining that the fact that the experience of a white man and a black man or woman of any color is this different, explaining that alone being a thing is a problem feels like an affront, because what does it mean? It means to the white person, you're telling them that your experiences that are not the fact that we don't share them, your experiences are potentially because of an advantage that you have that we don't have. To them, it then seems like, okay, the black man, the woman, whatever other group, it seems like from the word go, when they explain these experiences to them, it seems like they want to take away this advantage from them, because that's their normal lived experience. And when it feels like, when someone feels attacked, that their default stance is to be defensive, to either dismiss entirely these experiences as maybe not the normal experience of a black man or a woman or any other group that may be marginalized in some capacity, whether it is within their communities or within the workforce. So it feels like an affront to them.
I
That
think
is the problem.
I think as well, it feels like an affront, but it also feels like you're telling someone that they are only where they're at because they've had it easy. Nobody likes feeling
Yeah.
like they were handed anything, right?
Yeah.
People, with good reason, enjoy having a sense of personal responsibility. You're able to own your circumstance. You can own your life, right? You can look around you, look at everything you have or don't have, and say concretely that this is entirely due to my own efforts. Um, this is entirely due to the work I've put in, the hours I grinded, the sleepless nights, the days that I went hungry. All of that shit culminated in where I am today, and I earned it, right? People like feeling like they earned everything around them.
Yeah.
And when you hear that the things you have might not own, that the percentage of what you've earned directly isn't 100, right? That does feel like an affront to people. It does feel like you're like, who are you to tell me that I've had it easy? And you'll find very often in these conversations, if you try and talk to a person about this, a white person about this, the first thing that normally comes out, right? And it's almost like fucking clockwork. Someone will say, do you know how hard I've worked? It hasn't, no one gave me anything. You know, were you there when I did this? What, A, B, C? Like, it's, but I start bringing out receipts, right? As if they're applying for the position in your life. And you're like, dude, no, I'm not saying anything like that. But just like you're saying, the simple acknowledgement that one's circumstances can be, one's circumstances are wholly alien, right? But not only are they wholly alien, they're wholly alien to the point that they generate different experiences. And the fact that people can't acknowledge that your experiences are entirely as a result of your circumstances, that your future, your present, is like generated almost, the percentage of your input, right, in your current circumstances cannot be divorced from the initial set circumstances that preceded you, that preceded your buy-in, that preceded your ability, right? That there was a story about your life that was written before you knew when to put down to it. And one day you wake up and you find yourself in a position where now you have to contribute to that tale. But in a very large portion, in a very large aspect of it, the preconditions for that tale were written long before you had any input, any buy-in into this. And that idea is very difficult to get across, I think, in large part because when you interact with people, right, the story that we tell, and especially in our circumstance, right, in countries that have this capitalistic lilt, right, the story that we tell everybody is you can be whatever you want, that anything you want, you can have if you work hard enough, if you're smart enough, if you grind hard enough. You can always do it. You can always make it happen, right? It's all on you.
Paper.
Yeah.
Great on paper.
It's great on paper, the idea that everything's on you, but it's not, right? And now when you've been told your entire life that everything's on you, it's not a comfortable experience to be confronted directly with evidence to the contrary, right? With evidence to the fact that it wasn't on you, and in fact that you could have if you were in a different circumstance, right, you would not have been able to do what you've done now. That,
even with the same amount of input.
Yeah, that with the same input, the same character drive, the same intelligence, the same ideas, if we took you as you are as an individual, as you think you are, right, if you could somehow do that and just change your circumstances, we would change the result. Your life would look radically different, right? And that acknowledgement isn't there, but it's also very difficult to, if somebody doesn't already understand that, right? It takes a lot to get them there. This is one of those situations where it's like, trying to explain mathematics to a chimpanzee, right? It's not like there are number games, for example, right, that chimpanzees can play, right, that these creatures can play, but it takes a long time to get them to grasp it would take a long time to get them to grasp the actual concept behind what you're trying to do with them. And this is not to say that white people are chimpanzees, even though we all are. Or also, interesting tidbit, every human being who exists on the planet right now who isn't directly from Africa, right, has Neanderthal DNA in them. So actually, black people are more evolved than white people, but that's a separate conversation. But
I'm not gonna indulge you. No, I will not indulge you.
but the point just being like, it's hard to. These are things that are just very difficult to get across, right?
Yeah.
That like if somebody doesn't already understand this, it's like, how do you, in your experience, because I've only had one time in my entire life that I've actually seen somebody move from not understanding this to understanding this. And this process took me having to reveal a large portion of my own life story, right? Some extremely traumatic experiences and all that shit, right? To get them there. However, it doesn't feel to me like the bar for reaching this level of understanding should be the trauma of someone else's experience. So what do you think we can do to try and make it just in the idea space to make this clear to people who don't already agree with it?
Oh man, That is that is the eternal question for any marginalized group, because eventually what ends up happening, and this is largely something that I've experienced myself. You end up being emotionally drained by trying to engage in these conversations, because what happens is, similarly to what happens to a white person, when it feels like they're being attacked, or when it feels like every experience you're bringing up is an affront to their own experiences. What happens to you as the person who's trying to engage and enlighten and at least shed some light into what what it means to be part of a marginalized group, right? Or at least a historically marginalized group. Um, what usually happens is, because this is a intellectually taxing enterprise. It is an emotionally draining one, because what happens is, when you engage, it feels like every single experience that you are bringing up is being dismissed offhand, nonchalantly even, dismissed offhand as invalid. And when that happens, in some cases, it will give rise to an anger from the person who's trying to enlighten. So it's very hard to think of a better way to engage in these discussions, because ultimately what happens is, it feels like your experiences are being dismissed offhand as invalid. It feels like you're talking to someone who's not willing to see or listen. And then at that point, it becomes a it becomes an enterprise in futility. Like the exercise is, it's a futile one. So I don't know how we can broach the discussion of how different the default white experience is from the default black experience, from the default experience of a woman, from the default experience from anyone from a marginalized group. I don't know how you tackle that, because the default response from anyone from the white group, or at least the default response from most people being engaged, is to not listen, to not try and understand.
I think we can probably draw inspiration from the gay community here, because I know, in my own path to where I am now, there was a large period of time when I was myself homophobic, or not even purely homophobic, but very dismissive of the experience of being a gay person, right? You would always, like, I would always say that kind of that shit of, oh no, it's just a choice. What are you guys doing? It's a sin.
So
It's just a phase. That kind of shit.
So in large part, this was informed by your own religious bias at the time.
It was, yes, it was largely informed by my own religious bias, right? But even before I left religion, this was one of the things that, excuse me, that I left behind me in contact with actual gay people. Um, and the lesson I learned, or rather the way I came out of it, right? Even when I was deeply Christian, how I was able to move away from that homophobia was just, there's a great power in when you actively listen to someone, right? Without the expectation of wanting to say anything, right?
Yeah,
Just
without giving into the urge of confronting what they're saying.
yeah, just entertaining the fact that there is this difference, right? And then just saying, all right, let's see why you think you have this, right? Because so I actually remember, how old was I? I was like, oh gosh, maybe like 19 or something, and I asked somebody. I was like, okay, tell me why you're gay, right? Which, in retrospect, is really an idiotic question to ask anybody. God,
It's basically it's basically like asking someone, why are you straight?
it is, yeah, it is like asking someone why you're straight. But I didn't get that at the time, and fortunately for me, the person didn't do what they should have done and knock my fucking head off. Um, and then they were just like, okay, firstly they did say to me, I don't have a choice in the matter, but, and then they said something interesting, like, even if I could choose, I would choose to be this way because it's part of who I am in these and these ways. And they didn't go into that thing of explaining to me their life story, but They just told me what it means to them to be themselves, and how they could never, how unconscionable it would be to them, the idea that
something else.
to be, not only to be something else, but the idea that they could do better. Like they felt like the maximum possible way that they could be themselves, the best possible version of themselves, included this fundamental thing. And this is an idea I didn't get at the time. It's obviously fucking obvious in retrospect, but this is, I think the overall the lesson we should be able to do, right? This is one of the things we probably should be able to do, is teaching people, our children predominantly, but just people in general, that sometimes you need not have a vocal opinion. That sometimes it's actually okay to not have the final word or final say on any given subject, but to just to hear people out and say, let me hear what you say. I don't have to agree with you. I think this is part of the problem, is that we have this expectation that any kind of discourse that takes place between individuals must leave with the winner or loser, right? We always have this zero-sum mentality when it comes to how we talk to one another. But being able to say, not even saying I don't agree with you, just being like, hearing someone and say, okay, and then walking away. Like, this is something that I actually rarely see when you see people in conflict with one another, right? And you'll find very often, for example, that friends will actually have disagreements in their minds, but won't vocalize them for the fear that it's going to turn into a fight. That it's going to, and I'm sure we've all been in situations where vocalizing a disagreement turns into a fight, but
Yep.
just the ability to disagree, but also just to be like, I don't have to agree with you. Like, there's this expectation that anything that someone says, you have to take on completely and say, yep, this is also my life. This is exactly how I feel as well about everything. But just the simple acknowledgement that people have different experiences, people have different thoughts, people have different stories, and being okay with it and not expecting that life should be homogenous in that way.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, what it boils down to is moving away from the binary idea that things are black and white.
Non-black and white, but it's hard, dude. Like, to find people who are not. You know how hard it is to actually disagree in public with someone. I got into a fight the other day because of this kind of thing. Well, not a physical fight, but it was a deep argument about blasphemy. We were,
Blasphemy.
yeah, and in that argument, it's just because I felt like it was an argument that honestly wasn't worth having, right? Because the person was complaining about me being blasphemous in the space around them, and I didn't feel it's a conversation worth having, because I didn't think there's things that any given person around me will say and believe, and if they're not talking to me, or if it has zero effect on my life, the thing that they're saying, there's times when you have to challenge things, when you hear something honestly salacious and honestly just like mind-bogglingly fucked up, but in general, just there are times where you can just like leave it alone and say, well, okay, that person's in that corner doing their thing and not impacting on me in any material way. It becomes a problem when it clearly has an impact on the lives around you, but you know, if it doesn't, I feel like we can leave each other to believe stupid things or believe things that we don't agree with, without it becoming like you're saying, a binary situation where you are a bad person for holding that view or for believing that thing. I do believe there are some views you can only hold if you are a bad person. For example, the idea that men and women, or that women are subservient to men in some way. I think you have to be a bad person to believe that, but there's a lot of things where you can give people the benefit of benign neglect and leave you alone and say, I'm not even gonna think about this, I'm not even gonna entertain it, just leave it in itself and move on. Speaking of actually things that make you a bad person for believing, right? What do you think of this view, which I also think kind of makes you a bad person for believing? This view that I've heard floating around on the internet lately. I'm not sure if you've heard about it, but the the idea that, the immigration into Europe and the immigration problem in general,
Yeah.
but this view that immigration is effectively the death knell of any given civilization or society.
Listen, listen. I don't know if people are aware. Like, okay, so here's the thing, right? Maybe there's practical reasons to, and even this I say tentatively. Maybe there's practical reasons to argue the merits of how immigration is carried out.
Agreed.
But, 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 to argue that immigration is the death of a nation is patently ridiculous. And I'll tell you why. Because literally almost every single nation that exists is a nation founded by immigrants. If the Americans think that let me tell you how the Native Americans feel. They're probably looking at them like a bunch of idiots. If we're gonna bring in Great Britain into this conversation, these are people. These are people that conquered other lands and basically set their flags on a whole bunch of lands. Like, the idea that immigration is the death of a nation is patently ridiculous to me.
I agree. It's I don't know. Like, it's very hard most of the time, right? Like, I understand that, like you say, there are practical limitations to immigration, right? Obviously, because any given nation, the reality is that there's always finite resources, and you have to manage how many people are in that space to distribute the finite resources amongst, right? It doesn't help to have everybody in one place, because one place cannot sustain everybody. That's just the practical reality of it, right? But usually when you hear somebody with the view that immigration will kill any given country, very rarely is it steeped in practicality, right? Most of the time,
Yeah.
people are going to talk about the ethnography. They're going to talk about the
The
change in
culture.
ideological stances, the change in culture, etc., right? The idea being that there is some sort of sacredness to any given ethnic group or culture that should be protected at all costs. Not, I don't know. To me, it feels like part of this is it's a reflexive fear, right? Of waking up one day and feeling like the people around you don't no longer quote unquote
No longer
represent you.
resemble you.
No longer represent. That's a much better word. Yes, no longer resemble you, right? And the idea that going forward, resemblance is something that actually should matter. Like, it does matter right now, right? Definitely. And part of the reason why it matters is because we have to fix the problems that we've had before about who resembles whom in which given situation. So, like we were talking about earlier, within the gaming structures, you can't have a situation where the the community of gamers don't resemble the place that the gamers are in. But the overall idea that you can't feel comfortable in a place that no longer resembles you culturally and ethnically feels weird. I mean, I can sort of get it if somebody's talking about a situation where they no longer feel like they are welcome in any given space, but I don't think that that's a problem that is uniquely posed by immigration. Like, the time scale over which immigration will cause this problem, right? Is it's not a lifetime. It's not like one day you're gonna wake up. Like, it's not like any of us are gonna wake up and find that Zimbabweans have just overrun the country and everything's Zimbabwean, right? Like,
Yeah.
the time, if there's ever a time when Zimbabweans are the majority of the populace in South Africa, it's not in our lifetime, right?
Not even remotely.
It's not in our lifetime. It's not in our children's lifetime. This is gonna take a while, and by the time we get there to the point where this is that much of a
Our
problem,
opinions won't matter.
our opinions won't matter. There will be different people then. The country will look different because it will be different. And whatever culture is theirs then will be theirs. It's gonna have zero impact on ours right now. So it feels like this scaremongering thing. And you're like, guys, this actually isn't a problem. Like, if it's a problem, it's a problem for your great grandkids, not for you. So why worry about it to the extent that you're worrying about it right now? Like,
That's actually a pretty interesting idea. Uh, the idea that I mean I've never believed in it, but I think it's an interesting idea that anything that any culture, any societal group, that any traditions, those those concepts are sacred to the point where shifting away from them is akin to blasphemy.
so this is actually a conversation I was having yesterday. We're talking specifically about circumcision and about going to the mountain, as it were, right? As a Xhosa man, right?
As a
Now,
Xhosa man, I know this.
you know this, right? You this is your life, right? Now, the reason this came up, right, is because there was an article we were reading about. They were talking about licensing it, right, and making sure that people have to attend specific courses, etc., right? And
And
so
they have the actual skills necessary to carry out this shit.
now, in my view, personally, right, I don't think it's a cultural tradition worth keeping, right? Personally,
I am in that camp as well.
but if you must keep it and if you must do this thing, right, then definitely there has to be a new way to reimagine it, right? There has to be a way in which you do it safely. Like that, it has to be the case where any botch or any young man losing his penis or gaining some messed up infection during the process, right, is a legitimate aberration, and it's not like just part of the it shouldn't be a significant enough part of the statistics of people who go to the mountain, right? That we have to talk about it. It should be like, oh, that one guy, something fucked up happened to him, but it's not. It doesn't
It's not
illustrate
the
any
norm.
trend at all. Yeah, it's not the norm, right? So, but this is, and obviously attendance in that, right? Would be a conversation about how regulation must happen, and as a result, whenever you talk about regulation, right, you have to involve the government, or you have to involve some form of structure, right, some official structure in order to manage how this is going to go down, and obviously people don't want to hear that there will be non-cultural influences that are regulating cultural practices. And to me, I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of cultural practices which we've abandoned for very good reason, and there hasn't been that much complaining about why we don't do it that way. For example, I think we can all agree that under almost all scenarios, monarchy is a bad idea, right? Culturally, and like I'm not even talking about like international monarchy, locally, just in South
You're praying.
Africa,
Oh no, I know. Yeah,
we've
it's it's not the greatest thing at all.
we fucked up monarchy many times, and we've all agreed basically collectively, let's not do this, right? There are a couple of holdouts in many places, but for the most part this is something that we can usually get behind, right? But and there's new ways for people to reimagine how to practice out the cultural idea of structural hierarchy within your community, right? And people have done this um, by having greater credence placed on the elders' decision in any given family structure, right? Rather than having them be king. Or in any given community, there are families that are somewhat more prominent in terms of the words they say carry a greater weight, and that sort of replaces the monarchy structure. But in a way, these cultures have evolved, right? And it feels like, basically for me, it feels like usually when cultures evolve organically, there's little to no complaints about it, at least not as vocal a complaint about it, right? But
Yeah,
whenever you vocally say this aspect of our culture must evolve, that's when you get like insane pushback. Even
yeah,
though if
because
you gave it the time, it might end up that way anyway.
so the thing is, I think maybe the reason that there's that much opposition when it's a vocal thing, and it's not happening organically, is once again coming back to the idea of people feeling like you're attacking them. It comes down to potentially people perceiving this this suggestion as an affront to what they've already been doing. To them, it basically seems like you're saying this way you're doing it is the wrong way, and people don't like hearing that or perceiving that as something that's coming from someone else, potentially someone who's even outside of this culture. And speaking of which, so as we've been mentioning cultural things, um, this brings up the um, interesting thing that's happened as far as cultures go, and how putting westernized religion, because argue it as much as you may want, organized religion, whereas we're talking about Christianity and all its numerous denominations. This is a very Western thing that we adopted. It's interesting to see how it affected cultural faith systems. Now, black people, for the most part, adopted this, and there's still quite a lot of holdouts to cultural faith systems. But it's interesting to see that Christianity, or any other, I guess, westernized denomination of Christianity, was basically embraced and led to cultural faith systems even being vilified. Now, this just to clarify my position, I also find cultural faith systems to also just be abhorrent to who I am. but that's another conversation. What are your thoughts on how these faith systems that are essentially diametrically opposed to each other coexist within this country?
That's actually something I find very interesting, because you'll find that people are capable of actually holding what would on its face seem like completely opposite views, or views that would appear to be incongruent with one another, but they find ways to hold them. So you'll find Christians who will appeal to the ancestors, or you will find the deepest Catholics going to a sangoma, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And to me, I think it's more because what people did in embracing Christianity as a religious ideology, right? What they, as much as it became a part of our culture, right? What they started doing with the traditional belief systems is they shifted those into being more tied, like purely tied into the cultural framework, right? So you can it no longer became the case where you could believe this thing without being Xhosa, without being Zulu, without being Tsonga, etc. That becomes part of how you experience the culture itself. So the culture starts to orientate itself around the older traditional practices, whereas the ideology or the framework of how we think about the world now is now steeped in Christianity. So it's really interesting. I think the thing for me that I find very interesting is how people have done this, and they've done it in a way that you get to, I think the reason you do this is that you get to preserve particular traditional beliefs, right? Because there's a lot of cultural traditions that when you try and hang on to them purely for the sake of the culture, right, it's very difficult to justify. And that's the one thing that religion is always very good at doing, is giving you a good reason to continue doing something well past its sell-by date. And what the traditional belief systems do is they allow you to do that with particular cultural norms. You can keep them well past the point where the context within which they were born is relevant anymore. But you can keep that because you still take on the traditional beliefs. And even though you've changed your religious motivations in the rest of your life, traditionally and culturally, this meme holds. And you can hold, like, people are very good at diametric thinking. So you can be like, when I choose to, then I'll be more Christian today, or I'll be more traditional the next day, and it's fine, depending on what I need out of life on any given day. And you're allowed to do this. I think, honestly, I do think it's a good thing. And the reason I think it's a good thing is because it allows somebody who's willing to sit and really think about the situation, right, to see that inherently neither belief system has pure foundation, right, and that both of them are being held traditionally, and that they're both being held as part of the cultural framework within which you live. And that allows you to divorce them from how you think about it, how you think about the world. rather than how you experience your family, experience where you're from, experience your culture, etc. So in that sense, it's a good thing. It's also a bad thing because you take on a lot of bullshit. You say and do a lot of insane things that you wouldn't do otherwise. But it if you're willing to do the hard job of, like you were saying earlier, questioning everything that you know and everything that you come from and everything you believe, then it's a good sample size. It's good data, right? It's hard, for example, if you are completely steeped in Christian tradition, right? It's harder for you to see the problems with Christian tradition if you can't contrast it with other traditions. But if you're in a situation where you have ancestral worship and Christianity as part of the framework of how you identify culturally, then if you really want to, you can be like, okay, let me sit, compare and contrast, and then in that comparing and contrasting, you can be like, oh, okay, both of them don't necessarily hold as much water as I thought they did. Maybe there's something else. Maybe there's another way to think about this, and it makes life a bit more interesting in that regard.
Yeah, I just think it's very interesting because the one thing you'll come across specifically with organized religion is absolutes, right? And I find it interesting to see that a lot of people are willing to bend absolutes for whether it be the cultural side of their lives, or any other reasons. And I guess that points back to why I find it very difficult to even remotely remotely hold on to a lot of the stuff I was raised up in, is how what's the word? How contradictory ideologies can be towards actual practical living.
Yeah, that is very, very true. There's one thing though that actually the traditional beliefs do that I think is missing from when you don't no longer have them, and I'm saying this even from my personal experience, is that it does give you a way to connect with your forebears, in a way that's not necessarily accessible through Christian tradition or through living in the 21st century. It gives you a connection to the past that you would otherwise lack, and it's a lack I feel like personally, because there are people in my life
History
who,
doesn't speak. History
yeah,
doesn't speak very much about us. Yes, that is true.
history doesn't talk about us, but traditions do, right? This is the only history you have. This is the way we contextualize our memory, contextualize our stories. It gives it life, it gives it meaning, right? It removes the dryness of simply reading about particular people. It makes it more real for you. And
Yeah.
when you cut that connection, it starts to feel viscerally less real, and you have to think about the world in different ways. It's literally game changing when that happens. And I know this for my own example. Like, personally, I've seen this happen in my own mind, how that shift happens when you no longer have a traditional way to connect to the past. You no longer have a cultural way, rather, to connect to the past, and all you have now is lifeless history. It loses its life, it loses its texture, it loses its richness, right? And if nothing else, holding on to some of the traditional beliefs, even though they are basically vacuous in terms of their grounding, it's that connection still matters, and losing it is a problem. Losing it is something that you cannot replace, that cannot be replicated elsewhere in the world, that you feel it when that happens to you. It's a decision. It's honestly a decision I'm not sure is always a good one to make, or rather, it's not a good one to make if there's nothing else that can fill that space. So
Yeah.
that space of being able to connect to your past, to your ancestors, to the reason how you came to be where you are today, there has to be traditional beliefs, especially like traditional religious beliefs, seem to be the mechanism by which you can relate to your past in a way that you can't, that Christianity could. I think the reason why they kept it, because people realize that as great as Christianity can be going forward and to connect us going forward, fine, great, but there's a way in which we've always connected to one another that cannot be replicated even by new beliefs, even if we all agree with the new beliefs, there's that old context is something that you need to be able to articulate, and that's why you have to keep the religious motivation, because otherwise stories and texts can fall through the cracks, and those cracks don't fulfill the role that connection to your forebears gives you.
Yeah. No, I guess from a historical point of view, I guess there is some relevance. There is definitely some relevance. It's just, man, some of the practices.
The practices, I agree, are, I think this is okay. So for me, I think this is where you can like tie it all together and say that the ideas, right, and what you think about it and how you use it to contextualize, to connect with the rest of your family and the rest of your culture, the rest of your society, that can be good, right? The problem generally comes in when specific ideas inform specific practices and specific actions in the world, and that's where we have issues. And I think this applies even not to traditional religions, but to the contemporary organized ones as well. Is that like there's some ideas which are good, some are bad. It's like whatever, believe what you want, but then when those beliefs start to have a direct impact into the world around you, that's when things get a bit dicey, and that's when things get a bit like, now we all have problems here, bruh.
Yeah, I definitely think so, and I think ultimately one of the biggest, at least in my eyes, one of the biggest failings of contemporary religion is the lack of fluidity in terms of relevance. I think maybe that's part of why some of us find it difficult to remotely stay entrenched in any organized religion, because ultimately religions were formed thousands of years ago and formed in a time where I guess some of the stuff made sense. But in context of where society is right now, where society is going, the texts, as far as relevance, they lose it very quickly.
I agree. Well, we've actually been at this for about 2 hours, so I think we can tie it off there. Thanks a lot for your time, D.
No problem.
This
Oh, it's been
is,
good. I haven't actually done a podcast in ages, and it feels good.
I suspect you'll be back. I suspect this is not going to be the last time we speak.
Definitely
But
not.
do you want to tell people where they can find you on the social meets?
I mean, you can follow me at Saint__underscore crazy underscore D. That's crazy with a K. Um, I mean, I'm tentative about telling you my Facebooks because we delved into religious shit. But hey, Ndimphiwe Mayekiso, which will be an adventure for those who are not who are not of African cultures.
Well, thanks a lot, D. And guys, thanks for joining us. And that's episode 3, and we're done. Thank you for taking the time to listen today. If you enjoyed what you heard, you can like us on YouTube, share on your favorite social media, and most importantly, give us feedback. Tell us what you liked, tell us what you didn't like, and tell us what you'd like to hear in future. But above all, give yourself a pat on the back and continue to have interesting conversations.